Introducing Kurt Carlson, who is the president and CEO of Stanford Research Institute, and he's going to speak. And shoot him dead.
Thank you, Doug. I want to talk a little bit about the value proposition and how I think about Doug's ideas and how we apply some of them at SRI. I'm going to make some very simple concepts, and I hope it doesn't offend anyone. I want to do it to make a contrast so that when I contrast some of those things with Doug's thoughts, we'll be able to see the difference. So I hope you'll bear with me on this. Let's see, wrong way. So Einstein once was asked, what is the most powerful force in the universe? And he said, compound interest. He may or may not have said that, but compound interest is still an amazing thing. And this is the central theme and concept behind my talk today. Now here's a simple caricature of what it means to build a product. Someone has a tool and they build a product. So that's good. And historically people have worried about quality at the same time. But this was pretty much kind of the mindset. Get the product out and you're done. Now, what Doug is talking about is a knowledge accumulation model. Basically, you have a product, and in some sense it becomes a tool, tool one, which helps you build another product, product two. And that product can be used as a tool to help you make the third product and keep this process going. Now, you'll recognize that as basically being an equation that says the next thing that I produce is equal to what I have now times some fraction, 1 plus k, and if k is bigger than 1, it basically derives a differential equation for an exponential. So the goal of all this is to, in fact, create exponential performance improvements. And some well-known exponentials. Moore's law is a classic version of this, where the power of computers doubles every 18 months. Metcalfe's law is a different kind of law, but it's also an exponential. It says basically that the value of a network goes up as the square of the number of connections. That was not true before we had the internet. Back when we had radio and television, basically it was a linear model. Every time you added another consumer, that particular value proposition went up by 1. In this case, when you add another consumer, it goes up by n squared. So it's fundamentally different from what we had. It's not the radio, it's not television, it's something different. And these are powerful forces, as Einstein suggested, that we pay attention to. Now, these ideas have been around for a long time. So here's my simple caricature of what the job was a long time ago. You pick berries, raise kids, hunt, pick berries, raise kids, hunt, pick berries, raise kids. That's a different kind of recursive process, but pretty fundamental. But nevertheless, even though people were doing that, they were basically still on this exponential improvement curve, even though, as I say up there, we were on the Taylor series part of the curve that was linear. At least it seemed linear at the time. Now, so you can put Doug into this context. Basically, an A-level task would be to grow or gather food. B is an axe, so you can do it better. And C, developing new materials and processes is a way to improve B so you can improve how you do A. The NIC was the campfire where everybody got together. That was the network improvement community. The dynamic knowledge repository in the Kodiak was old folks telling stories. By the way, it's hard to improve on that. The most compelling form of communication is in the form of a story. And I would say that just that one example shows you how far away we are scientifically from having the kind of capability that Doug dreams about. The MetaNEC was the annual powwow where all the different communities got together and shared stories about how they can improve the processes that they're using to improve how they do their business. And there are lots of examples. Language is one that evolved this way. But you go from the stone axe to the bronze axe to the iron axe, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a nice set of metaphors here. So what's different with Doug? These ideas are as old as mankind, so I tried to write down what I think is different about Doug in the way he views the world. And I've emphasized a few things here. Networked improvement community. Networked is the key word here. It's often said that point of view is worth 80 IQ points. The objective of a networked improvement community is to collect as many plus 80 IQ points as you can. That's collective intelligence. We're a lot smarter as a group, orders of magnitude, than we are individually. It's recursive. That's the bootstrapping idea. It builds on itself. In fact, Doug is recursive, his model, in every way you can imagine. It really is a very thorough analysis of how many recursive ways you can build value to make an improvement community. It's comprehensive. There are many NICs. Product quality circles obviously have been around for a long time, but Doug says, well, that's not enough. Quality, of course, is important. It's fundamental. That's one of the really key things we ought to pay attention to, but it's not enough. It applies to every aspect of the job: innovation, new product development, ethics, all kinds of issues that intercept what makes progress possible. It's inclusive. People often talk about computers and machines, but they forget to talk about people. And I'm going to argue shortly that the people part of this equation is extremely fundamental. Great. Okay, let's see. I was at inclusive, machines and humans. As I said, I'm about to argue that the human part of this is equally as important, particularly in the world that we're about to enter. Doug's approach is systematic. We've just made a little joke about A tasks, B tasks which improve A, and C which improve B so you can improve A. But that kind of thinking is systematic. And every time you have a situation where you don't have a B and a C, it's a little red flag that ought to go up and say, maybe I've got an opportunity to do a better job. It's intelligent and persistent. Again, I made a little joke about old folks telling stories, but it shows to you the value of that.
I took it personally.
Doug's a great storyteller, and we're all here because of his ability to tell stories. So I'd actually say he's a perfect example of the point I'm trying to make here. And it has to scale. There are many meta-NICs. So a meta-NIC is one that is to improve the NICs, but there are many. It's not just one kind, and we can learn from everyone. So we all know about some exponential doubling times. Computers, memory, fiber optics, the human genome, the web. There are lots of them these days. But eventually, they're going to impact things that really matter to us, like shelter, food, medicine, entertainment, education. Education basically hasn't been touched yet, as you all know. It's a really important problem. Entertainment, we're beginning to see that as soon as there's one so-called standard, we move on to another level of technology. It's gotten to be really interesting. Back in the 50s, a standard like radio or television would stick around for 50 years or more before another one would come up. It's not true anymore. Medicine is a profound one. We're being seen now as basically, big strings of software in treating us as information. And once we start treating ourselves as information, then we go on the equivalent of Moore's law in terms of how we're going to be treated and the way we're going to interact with our doctors. So I just say, so obviously this isn't going to last forever. So just to make this point one other way, 30 years ago, most stuff was on a 30 to a 50-year doubling time scale. And Moore's law was down at the bottom of the economy, and even though it was chunking along at 2 times every 18 months, frankly, it didn't affect very much. Well, that's different today. Moore's law now intercepts just about everything. That's basically the motivation behind the bubble that we're going through right now. And of course, Metcalfe's law came along in the form of the internet as another driver to push the activity that's going on. Well, those aren't going to stop. And they're going to now affect most of that other stuff too, as I just tried to argue. So most of the things that are important to us are going to be on some kind of exponential in the era that we're going into. So the question comes up, well, if you want to be on an exponential, what are the key ingredients that you must satisfy to be on it? So I think there are 4 things. And I believe if one of these is missing, it doesn't work. I'm going to argue there are lots of other things too, and Doug has always argued there are a whole family of things, but at least these 4. First, it has to be an important problem. It has to be something basically where there's no limit. You double the performance. It's like raising a kid. You teach them something, you want to double that, and double it, and double it, and double it. There's basically no limit to how much you can teach your child. Education, fiber optic communications, I put this one down right now because for every halving of the cost of fiber optics communication, the market potential goes up by 50%. You can't satisfy it. So the companies that are after that market are basically doing everything they can to grow as fast as they can. Ideas. In order for you to stay on an exponential, there need to be new ideas. You can't grow if there aren't new ideas. That means concepts, representations, new technologies, inventions, systems, business innovations. Ultimately, business innovations have historically been more important than the technology. The technology opens the door, but it's the business innovation that really makes it work. And strategies, as Doug has already mentioned. Of course, you need resources, people and dollars. Today, dollars basically don't matter. You can raise lots of money. The only thing that's really important is do you have a really keen idea and do you have the people? And you need a recursive process. Build it and iterate. Build it and iterate. Build it and iterate. If you have these things, you can be on an exponential. So at SRI, just to give you an example, we take these ideas quite seriously. And we apply them to a couple of different kinds of activities. So we apply these when there's an important problem. If it's a trivial problem, we don't think about it. We just do it and get on to the next thing. But if there's a really important problem that society needs solved, we will go after that one. That requires a vision and a strategy to think about those. And I would say, when you think of Doug's classic work back in 1968, he had a very powerful vision that motivated Jeff and others to join him to make computers and humans more intelligent, to be able to create a more productive and worthwhile environment. Champions and teams. So I like passion. I like people who have passion. I believe people with passion change the world. Doug is a passionate champion of his ideas. You need ideas. You need lots of smart people in many disciplines because most of the problems that are interesting today are multidisciplinary. You need multiple representations. In mathematics, it's known that if you don't have at least 2 representations, you can't solve a hard problem. Fermat's last theorem was solved with something like 40 or 50 different transformations to be able to look at that problem in enough ways to solve it. That's a metaphor that's useful for all of us in our work today. And their business models, processes, and human considerations, which I'll come to in a minute, and a recursive process. So what this means is if you are putting together a proposal, you put it down quickly, you put it in front of people, you collect ideas, you create another version, you do it again, you do it again, you do it again. If you're doing a demonstration, it's not enough to talk about it. Talking about it doesn't do it. It doesn't capture the idea. You've got to build the demo, put it in front of people, collect their ideas, implement it again, collect more ideas, implement it again, and do that. And do that really fast, and do that with enthusiasm. And if you do that, you get on, there's no such thing as an exponential for this kind of activity, but there's something that looks an awful lot like it. And it's fun when you do this. Now, I want to get back to another thing that Doug emphasizes, which technology may be a driver for this, but the thing that makes it work is people. And it's perhaps the most important thing in the world today. The technology is going to come. It's the question of how do you treat and think about people. People make exponentials work or not work. If you have a company that has a doubling time of 2 every 6 months, and you have a personnel crisis in your company, you can be out of business. It's very nonlinear when these kinds of effects come together and you get involved in a business that's so dynamic that it's doubling every 6 months or 12 months. anything, a financial crisis, a personnel crisis, it can basically crack the bubble and put you in jeopardy. So these funny words that are on this view graph are actually things that we take very seriously. The 3 commandments: respect, integrity, generosity of spirit. At SRI, we have at least 6 NICs that I can count that are up and running. And I went to the person who runs one of them the other day, and I said, when you put together a NIC, what's the most important thing? And I thought she might say, you know, the application or something. She said, Kurt, it's respect and trust. I said, well, okay, that's true. I'm sure that's true. But what else comes to mind? She said, Kurt, it's respect and trust. I said, well, yeah, I understand that, but what else do you think about? Kurt, it's respect and trust. It's like, how many times do I have to tell him that if you want to have a network community and you don't have respect and trust, nothing can happen. Nothing can happen. It's really fundamental. So these funny words, you know, Dilbert stock and trade, cynicism, distrust, and misunderstanding. It's natural when you're changing an organization. Dilbert lives on that. And when you're on an exponential where you're doubling every 6 or 12 months, the amount of cynicism you can build up is enormous. So you have to name it. You have to address it. You have to deal with it. So without going through all these things, I really think that these things are important, more important than ever when you buy into this kind of a vision. And the reason I put staff as partners is I think that's the only way you can treat your staff in this kind of a world. They have to be your partners, or else you can't have that kind of relationship with them. And I think that's a really big transformation in the way we work. But by the way, it's a really nice work. There's nothing on this page that anyone would disagree with. They're all good values. They're all positive values. They're all values that help people grow and be bigger and better than they are.
There are intellectually.
Excuse me?
You haven't explained all the acronyms there.
Well, I actually wasn't going to. The DNA of change has to do with there has to be a demonstrated need to change. The N stands for a new vision, and the A is an action plan. If you don't have a need, a vision, and a plan, people don't change. But it's not enough. If you ask me if the company has a need, a vision, and a plan, and I don't fit into it, then I'm not going to buy into it. So this personal transformation bullet down on the left-hand side says Vision A to Vision Z. So I have to help you see how the skills that you have can be morphed into this new job, and that when you get there, not only are you going to be valued, you're going to be more valued and have more potential and more returns than you have today. That's my job as a manager. If I can't do that, you probably won't buy in. And so it goes.
FAIC and FUD.
Excuse me?
FAIC and FUD.
FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That comes up all the time. You have to address that. The motivation part, freedom to do your job, we have to respect people. A is achievement. If we're scientists, a lot of us are scientists in this room, the thing why we got into the business is for achievement. We want to make a difference. I stands for involvement. If you don't involve us in decisions that are important to us, that can affect our freedom to do our jobs or our ability to achieve, there'll be a crisis. It's predictable. There'll be a crisis. And C is community. We want to be part of a community. And I believe that companies that can address these 4 things are well on their way to keeping people. Jeff and I were just talking about this. Even if they're not getting the kinds of stock options they might be getting somewhere else. And I do know that if you don't satisfy these 4 things, no matter how much you pay people, they won't stick. They won't stay. They'll go somewhere else where they can get those done. So, you see I have a little passion on this topic too, right? Now, I went through this because I want to make a major point about Doug's work. If you think about, if you accept the idea that we're moving into an exponential world and the business models that we ought to have and the way we do business should be exponential, then you can look at other organizations and kind of quantitatively say, are they on that path? Or aren't they? Now, DoD research, corporate R&D, and incubators. I picked 4 things. Did this with Jeff and Doug the other night. DoD research. they actually go 6-1, 6-2, 6-3. They have a linear process for innovation. How can they be successful in this world? They're not, and they can't be. You can just look at it, the way they do business. They cannot be successful. Corporate R&D. Put a lot of really smart people in a building out in Montana someplace, and don't let them interact with the market and all the other people in the company, and you have to get permission from some vice president before you can go talk to somebody. How can this be useful? It can't. And it's basically going away in America right now. Incubators, that was another one we came up with. That one's a really curious idea. On the face of it, it's a really good idea. So let's take a couple smart people who want to form a company, we'll put them in a place, and we'll take care of their heating and give them janitorial services and those kinds of things. But there are no ideas in an incubator. It's kind of a sterile environment. It doesn't feel like an exponential environment. So you look at these and you say, what's missing? And it really becomes, if you think this way, it becomes really easy to look at them and say, what's missing and what should be added? So this diagram is an attempt to begin to think about some projects that would satisfy some of these requirements, and where you could go to people and make a challenge to them about why they ought to participate and ways that they might want to participate. So I mentioned DoD on the left-hand side. That's a great example because they're so fundamentally broken that that they have almost any improvement would make a big a change with how they do business. So what this says is go to DoD, and I'm going to do that, and basically say what they ought to do is form a NIC to pick some problem that's important to them and use it kind of as a benchmark for their thinking, just as I just suggested. Use it as a benchmark for how you're doing your R&D and the other parts of your business, and then borrow Jeff's idea from the last session, which is while you're at that, why don't you take 10% of your money that you want to spend on that and put it into a meta-NIC, the tools and teams box up there, and work on some really hard fundamental problems and begin to collect the experiences that you learn from that. So I put some possible things that need to be worked on. Collaborative environments basically don't work today. In spite of what people say, they don't work. There's no security. They're not interoperable. You can't have the kinds of collaborative tools you want. They just basically don't work. You can't do it. So that's a good thing to work on. And by the way, if it's out of the context of an application, it obviously doesn't make sense to do that. So DoD, here's something you can make a big impact on, but put it into the right environment. Databases, the Kodiak. I told the story of old folks telling stories. Well, that shows you how far away database technology is from the kind of goal that's required for this. That's a grand challenge problem. That's a good problem to work on. Human performance. I emphasize those human properties because they ought to be kept track of. And when that lady I mentioned, Judy, who said respect and trust, that should be understood. What does she mean by that? How do we capture that and begin to share that with people so that they won't have the same personnel crises the next time they form a NIC and want to basically do the same thing? And Doug mentioned World Health. I think that's another great application. I'm going to be giving a talk to the head of the National Cancer Institute, and I'm going to propose that they form one. Education. We already have a bunch of ones going in education. So if we could get them to be taxed according to Jeff's rule, maybe we could begin to put together a meta-NIC. And then maybe other groups would form other NICs, and they would have their meta-NIC, and then you could get people to share. And so then we'd begin to incrementally, recursively, if I could steal a word, move toward this vision that Doug has been laying out. So in conclusion, I think the goal of this ought to be exponential performance improvement. I think that's a grand challenge. I think it's inevitable, so I frankly don't think we have any choice. We have to move in that direction. A report requires important problems, champions and teams, lots of ideas, recursive processes and more, lots more, but great human values and involvement based on respect and trust. I kind of like that. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I have collected any ideas that I picked up from a lot of really smart people. And I just mentioned some here. Bill Wilmot, who's a wonderful guy. He runs a collaboration institute. He and I actually have a draft of a book on exponential teams. Norm Winarski, a colleague from Sarnoff, other people, my wife, and of course, Doug. So thank you.
Let's have some dialogue, don't we?